All right, welcome back. Gaby's going to be taking care of the Q&A over there. I'm going to actually be driving this module, so you're stuck with my jokes this time around. In case you're just tuning in, first of all, where have you been? Second of all, this is JavaScript for experienced developers. And then in particular, because there was a question about this in the Q&A, I do want to kind of re-emphasize here that by experienced developer, what we're actually talking about is experienced in particular with non-JavaScript languages. So that if you're making the move into JavaScript, or maybe if you're just trying to fill in some gaps, that's what this particular course is all about. So with that in mind, now let's turn our attention to something else that doesn't behave exactly the same way in JavaScript as it does in other programming languages, and that is threading. And so we're going to take a look at threading by introducing web workers, and then we're also going to start to add on a little bit of jQuery here. I'll talk about why in a couple of minutes with both promises and deferred. But first up, let's talk a little bit about web workers. So consider the fact that typically when you're writing JavaScript, because in particular you'll be writing this for, or quite often you'll be writing this for a browser, you might want to be able to do threading. Well, you're not going to be able to do threading. Think about this for a minute. That the whole goal of JavaScript is for me to be able to, as the developer, send code down to some unsuspecting user, and they just simply download that code, they trust that code, and they run that code. Think about all of the bad things that could happen there. So as a result, browsers are going to put a lot of constraints over exactly what it is that your JavaScript is and is not allowed to do. And one of the big things that was not allowed for quite a while was any form of threading. Obviously, though, this is a bit of a problem because if we want to be able to do any advanced processing, we want to be able to maybe do some graphics work on the client and really take advantage of all the processing power that's available on the client, we want threads. And so HTML5, the W3C, introduced this concept of web workers, which is how we can simulate threading. Now, if you're looking for kind of full threading support that you might have, say, in a .NET application or inside of a Java application, you're obviously not going to get that here, but this will at least give you what you typically need for most scenarios. So what's a web worker then? Well, a web worker is basically a process where we can tell the browser that we've got some script that's going to take a little while, and we want this to run asynchronously. Now, it's going to be a very simple threading implementation. For some reason, it just keeps wanting to zoom in every time I hit Control-2. That's fine. So it's a very simple threading implementation. But like I mentioned before, you're not going to have control over the thread itself. And on top of that, it's also going to be implemented through a very basic messaging system. So that what we're going to have is I'm going to have my little web page here. So here's my little browser, as it were, my terrible little drawing. And then over here, I'm going to have my little web worker. And so what I'll do is I'll go ahead and I'll send a message over to the web worker. The web worker will then go ahead and do its little work, do whatever it is that it might want. And then when it realizes, oh, I need to let the caller know what went on, it's then going to send a message back to the original caller, which in my little drawing here is going to be the browser. Now, one very big key to keep in mind with web workers is that they are going to be running on this separate thread over here. And so synchronization can become a bit of a problem. That what happens if I have a script on my page that's going to update the UI, and then my web worker wants to be able to update the UI? Then what do we do? Well, in order to just solve the problem by not allowing that problem to actually take hold, the rule is that the only thread, if you will, that's allowed to update the UI is the main browser thread. So the web worker itself is not going to be able to update the UI. In order to update the UI, it'll simply have to send a message back to the browser and then ask the browser or expect the browser to go ahead and update the UI. So it does not have the ability to update the UI directly. The web worker also has some limited access to the resources either on the system or in the browser. You'll notice, for example, that you don't have the ability to access the window object. You don't have the ability to access the document object. So there are some limitations around what the worker can do for both a synchronization and a security perspective there. So just to kind of limit things there. Now, the basic structure, the way that this is going to work is just like you see here. What you're going to notice is that we're going to give me a pen. There we go. We're going to create a brand new worker just by calling new worker. Now, one of the questions that's been coming up an awful lot in the Q&A is, what version of JavaScript are you using? Gabby, do you know what version of JavaScript we're using?
I sadly do not know.
Okay, and that's good. I don't know either, so we're in the same boat there. So we're using a version of JavaScript that's just simply going to work.
I will look into it, and if I find the answer, I'll put it in the Q&A.
There you go. But just to simplify things a little bit, I mean, we're using a version of JavaScript that just simply works. You know, that if you open this up inside of really any browser that's been developed in the last couple of years, everything that we're going to be doing is going to be just fine. The worker, however, is an HTML5 item feature component. And so as a result, you may find that some browsers don't support the worker. Again, every modern browser, I would say anything within about the last year or so, is going to support a web worker, but some older browsers may not. If you're not sure whether or not a browser supports the worker, just simply check to see if worker, capital W, because it's the name of the object, just check to see if it's null. If it's null, then that means that the browser doesn't support web workers. If it's not null, then you know that it does support web workers. Okay, let me go ahead and erase that. Beautiful. So now the next thing that you're going to notice is what I had mentioned earlier, which is the fact that it's a messaging-based architecture. So that we send a message to the worker by using post message, and the worker, let me just get myself a different color here, is going to send a message back to the original caller by also calling post message. So kind of a very simple messaging architecture here, that if we want to send a message to one side or to the other, it's the exact same method, simply post message. And that would send a message from one side to the other. Now, you're going to notice in my little sample script here that I just have basic text. You could absolutely use an object, and we'll come back and take a look at that in just a couple of minutes here and show how you could do that. You're also going to notice that the event in question, so that way if we send a message down to the worker or if we send a message to the calling script, the question then becomes, well, how do we actually capture that message? The answer is the message event, which you can see right here. So the message event tells me that we got a message in. So when we call post message, it's going to go here. And when we call post message the other way, it's going to come back over to there and then execute the code from there. Now, what's great about this is you're going to notice the similarity that it's the exact same setup on both sides. That if I want to send a message, regardless of where I am, it's post message. If I want to receive the message, regardless of where I am, it's that message event. Now, inside of that event handler, what you're going to notice is we're going to declare an anonymous function, which Gabby did a great job in talking about earlier. And we're going to add in a parameter. I like to call it E for event. And the data in the message, so whatever that payload is going to be inside of a property called data. So when I go in and I say, in my case, hello worker, and I send that on down here, that's going to wind up inside of that data property. And then you're going to notice down below when I go send something back, whatever it is that I sent back, is going to wind up inside of that data property over there. So very kind of a nice little mirror image there for our worker. One last little thing before I set up the worker. I do want to just mention real quick that inside of a worker script, self is going to be the worker. So it's just going to be self, not this, but self. You'll also notice that the script is going to execute immediately on load, but we'll talk more to that in a moment here. Okay. So let me go in and start setting everything up here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to set up a very simple echoing system here. So I'm just going to simply say div. I'm going to say label for equals message, and we'll say message. And then we'll go in and say input and type equals text and ID equals message. There we go. And I'm also going to make my life a little bit easier just from a formatting perspective. I'm just going to add in a couple of real quick classes here and add in a style sheet up at the very top. I wrote this out earlier. Boom. Of course, you put that into the exact wrong spot. There we go. All right, perfect. So now I've got that, and then let me also add in a real quick button. So we'll say button type equals button and ID equals send message, and class equals btn, and then send message. And then down below, we'll go in and set up an unordered list. ID equals message list. There we go. OK. So now what I want to do is I want to start setting up my, my basic little worker. And I'm going to do that by just setting up a script here. And I'm going to wind up just globally declaring my variable just to make my life a little bit easier here. So I'm just going to simply say worker equals, and I'm going to say new worker. And that's going to allow me to create that brand new worker. And in my case, I'm going to point to my demo.js, which I'm going to create in just a moment. And now what you'll notice off of that worker is that I could go in and add the event listener, as we saw on the slide, or we can just simply say onMessage equals, and then just create the function this way. Either way will work just fine. So this is going to receive messages from the worker. And again, I like to just simply use E there to go ahead and set that up. And again, I'm going to say var message equals E dot data. And so now I've got the message, and now I'm going to add that onto the unordered list. Now, I'm going to make my life a little bit easier here by utilizing jQuery. I've got everything pre-typed out just to make sure that if I make a mistake, I've got somewhere to go. So I'm just going to steal the reference to the CDN right here. OK. I'm going to side note real quickly here, tangent mode. So you're going to notice here that I'm calling out to a CDN or a content delivery network. Content delivery network, geographically diverse set of servers that are all designed to serve up very common scripts, including jQuery. So what's going to wind up happening is instead of the user downloading this from my system, they're going to get this from a remote system, in this case, one that's hosted by Microsoft, of course. The one little thing that I do want to mention, if you are going to open up this page or any of the other pre-canned demos that I already have, make sure that you launch it via a web server. So Control F5 to just launch IIS Express in order to be able to run it that way. If you just simply double click on the HTML file, it's not going to work, in which case you'd have to actually download jQuery and make the reference that way. OK. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go in and use my little syntax of pound for the ID and my message list. And then I'm going to append on my list item, whatever the message happened to be, and then close out my list item just like that. So when we receive a message, we're going to add that onto the list. We also have the ability to send a message on over. And so we do that by just simply setting up, in my case, a click event. So this is going to be send message click function, boom, boom, and we'll just go in and say, all right, well, when they go in and do a click, I want to say worker dot post message and a message. And our message is going to be var message equals, and then we'll just go grab that from our message value. OK, so just to review what I've done here, what you're going to notice up at the very top is I'm going to create my worker and point to the worker script. This is going to allow me to send or receive messages rather from the server, and the actual message is on the data property, which we can see right there. And then when we want to send a message, we just simply call post message. So that will send the message. Now, like I mentioned before, when we're inside of the worker script, it's basically the exact same thing. It's just like a mirror image. So I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm just going to copy, and I'm going to paste that code. But like we said before, instead of it being worker, it's just going to be self. There we go. And so again, the message is just going to be there. And when we want to send a message back, it's still going to be that exact same post message. So I'm going to receive the message, and I'm going to set up a very simple echoing system here, where I'm just simply going to say self post message, whatever the message happened to be, plus, and then processed. There we go, just like that. And I don't need the rest of that. Cool. So I think I've got everything. We're going to find out here. We're working live here. And I called it demo HTML. There we go. OK, so in theory, I should send a message, test, click send message, and sure enough, it came back from that worker doing that test process. So very simple way for me to go in and set up my little worker and be able to send a message over into a worker on a separate thread and then get that value back. Cool. But there's a couple little issues here. That one of the little things that we need to keep in mind, first of all, is that out of the box, that's all you get. You just simply get post message to send a message over, and you just simply get on message to receive the message. That's my little catch there. And that's it. That's all that we get. We don't get baked in events for, say, start and end. But this can be very easily implemented. That just simply set up a system where you're going to send a message over to say start or send a message over to say stop. So just go in and set up your own very basic messaging. The other very big thing to keep in mind is that even though in my first little demo, I just sent along a string, we also have the ability to pass along any JSON or JavaScript object. So if you want to just create the object and just send that on over, you could do that as well. And then you're also going to notice that if we want to stop the worker, from the page or from the caller, we call terminate. And from inside the worker, we call close. So let's actually take what we did there and kick that up a notch. Let's add in an object, and let's add in a little bit of a messaging system there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to come back over, and I'm going to set up a little object here. So we were watching Gabby earlier, so I'm just going to do this. I'm going to call this message object. Message object equals, and we're just going to use the little curly brace notation. And so I'm just going to say message colon, and then we'll just read in that message property. So what we've just done, and I know I've kind of used the exact same message colon message, this is going to be the new property that we've just created. This is going to be the data that will be inside of there. So that's going to be the setup. Whoops, I'm in the wrong spot there. You, come here. There we go. So now we're going to create that message object, which will then have that little property there for our for the message. So that's where it's going to wind up being. So now let me go over here into my little worker. And now what I want you to notice here is that instead of it being a message, here, let's just put these two side by side. There we go. And there we go. OK, so what you're going to notice is over here on this side, we've got the message object. So that's what's going to be inside of data. So let's make that a message object. Message object. And then we'll go in and say var message equals that message object dot message. So very simple little object. That one little property, we just buried it inside of there. So in theory, this should still do the exact same thing. So let's go back in. Let's go in and say test. And sure enough, uh-oh, I made a mistake somewhere. I want our message. And somewhere in here, I have, let's see, var message, message object, message, that all looks good. Post message, message object. I did save everything. Interesting. What are you doing to me? Post message, sending that over, post message. It's just that. And I want my on message. I should just be getting back the message. Yeah, it's just a string. Huh, cool. All right. Well, see, I told you we were going to have a live little demo here of the F12 tools. I'm going to try this real quick just to see what's going on here. So I'm just going to go into the debugger, and I'm just going to put a little breakpoint right next to my receive here. There we go. So that way I can actually see what that is. And then let's click send message. And this is what I really, really like here, is that it does give me the ability to see, and it is just tossing over an object. Well, that's interesting. OK, then. And you're not going to let me go to the source. OK, fine. All right. I apparently do have a little mistake somewhere. See, this is why I had everything pre-baked. So I'm just going to go right to my pre-baked. All right. In any event, see, we're really cooking here. So let's go in and take a look at my message object here.
I'll say someone said,
oh, yeah.
They're saying you're appending the object, not the message within the object. Object is misspelled right there.
Ah.
There you go.
There we go. Typos. OK, let's try this one more time.
They all just let me know.
That's interesting. Oh, I have it misspelled a couple of times. Message object is the data, message object, message. OK, and then let's just come over here, object, object. That all looks good. Message, message.
And then it says,
message,
read data.message instead of e.data?
No, it's going to be .data.
OK.
Yeah, it's always going to be .data.
And then this question has come up 3 times, and I didn't want to interrupt you, but since we're quickly doing this.
Yeah.
Is DOM available for a worker to process?
So, no. So that's a great question. So the question is the DOM available for the worker process? And the answer to that question is no. It's a security thing. So that anything that you want to have the worker work on needs to be done through the messaging. So you need to send the appropriate message over to the worker. The worker has to send the appropriate message back, and then the original page needs to update the UI. OK. You know what? I'm just going to close that real quick, just in case it's like caching something.
Oh, wait. And then it says the same person who said he is appending the object to the list, not the message member. So in the append of jQuery.
Ah, nope. Yeah. There we go.
Oh, never
yeah,
mind.
it was just so it was two things. It was my typo, and it was still cached. So now it's working. Okay. There we go. OK. So in any event, sorry about my little typo there. The next real quick thing, kind of moving on from here, is the ability to do messaging. So one of the catches with my worker is that the script is going to execute immediately upon load. Well, if you want to be able to do some form of like a stop and a start for any setup work or any cleanup work, that's going to be on your own. You're going to have to go in and do that. And so one very simple way that you could do that would be just to add on a little, stop and start status. So what I could actually do here, after I set everything up inside of my little script, if I wanted to set up start, is I could just simply say worker.postMessage, and then let's just do status equals start, just like that. And so now, let's come on over to our worker here, and now let's detect a start message. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my message object. We'll put that right up at the very top. And then I'm going to say if message object dot message equals start. And did I call it status or did I call it start? I called it status. I'm glad I looked. I have a great memory. It's just really short. There we go. There we go. We'll just move that around. OK, cool. So what you're going to notice here is that, again, there's no start-stop event system here. It's up to you to add that in. And so that's exactly what I'm doing here, is I'm just adding in my own start. Now, the other very big thing that you might be noticing here is I'm using 3 equal signs. One of the biggest issues that we have with JavaScript is the fact that it's weakly typed, which means, of course, that our data types could just change on the fly. And one of the things that you might have noticed from one of Gabby's earlier demos is she did string concatenation just throwing in integers. Because what JavaScript is going to do is it's going to go, oh, all right, well, I've got a string here, I've got an integer here. You probably wanted that as a string, so it will automatically do conversions. That can cause bugs. So if you want to ensure that not only is it equal to the value, but it's also the same type, you use the triple equal. So that's going to ensure that it's specifically a string there. And in my case, it's going to be start. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm just simply going to say self post message, and I'm going to say started. Now, what I could do on the other side, if I wanted to, is I could retrieve that message and say, oh, OK, well, if it started, then I want to do something else, like maybe I want to light the button up or something like that. So I could go in and implement that. But I think you kind of see where all of this is going. So now if I come back over here to my page, I hit refresh, you're going to notice that I now get started. And then you'll also notice that if I lob my test message on over, that I'm going to get back that processed. Cool. All right. So if you want, and we're just not going to have time to walk through the demo step by step here, but you'll actually notice that if you take a look at the GitHub repository, and I'll throw that up onto the screen in a moment here, but if you take a look at the GitHub repository, one of the things that you would notice is I've got the pre-canned demos there, and you'll notice that I've got a full setup here for our stopped and our started. So you're going to notice that I'm going to detect if it start, do whatever it is that we want. If we notice that you said stop, do a stopped right here. And then you'll also notice that we're going to just send the object back over. And then if I took a look at this, you'll notice that we've got the full setup here, fully commented as well, for detecting the fact that it was started. detecting the fact that it was stopped, and then processing, in this simple little example, a name here. So I've got all of that set up inside of there. So you could go back and take a look. Okay. Yeah.
Really quick, and if whenever you're open for questions.
Yeah.
So really interesting question was, trying to find it. I just had it.
That's okay. Take your time. It'll give me an opportunity to have a sip of water.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so are you able to use any library like jQuery inside the worker script?
So the question is, are you able to use a library inside the worker script? And in particular, jQuery was mentioned. But the answer to jQuery is explicitly no. And the reason for that is jQuery needs the DOM in order to do its work, and it's not going to have access to that. So the answer to that straight up is going to be no. As far as other libraries go, it's going to really just depend on what that library is and what that library does. So maybe. I will... we'll take a look a little bit later for an article that will explicitly lay out the objects that you can and can't access with through the worker.
And then one other question was, are you able to prioritize the worker thread?
No. So this is why I always like to put air quotes, and I don't like using air quotes, but it's the only way to do it. This is why I always put air quotes around threading, because it's a simulated threading environment. You don't get any control over it. So as far as things like process or priority or otherwise, you don't have the ability to do that. So cool. You can always just interrupt me, by the way.
Oh, I don't want. I feel like it was rude. I wasn't sure.
Just throw something at me. It's fine.
Okay.
All right. Now, here's the small problem with using our workers. Is in order to use a worker, you need to know that you're about to use a worker. That's not really a good thing. That whenever I'm writing some code and I'm going to get something else to manage this for me, I really don't care what the other end is doing behind the scenes. I mean, if it's, I don't know, going off and making a call to a server, or if it's using web workers or whatever it is, I really don't care, and I shouldn't care. I really should just be able to treat it like a black box, that I just simply say, hey, go do some work, and I get a response back. Okay, that's cool. But we need then some ability to hide what it is that we're doing. That what I want, the goal here, what I want is I want to be able to say, all right, go do this. And when you're done doing that, let me know, because I need to do something at that point. And this is where promises and deferred come into play through jQuery. We're going to start off with deferred, and then we're going to take a look at promises. What deferred will allow you to do is it will allow you to set up a middleman object. So that I call into this middleman object, it's going to do some magic, and it's going to let me know once it's completed, so then that way I can go ahead and run my code. That's what deferred is all about. So we can create our own long-running operations and allow developers to just simply register an event handler. And what's great about that is we can do whatever we want. So if we're going to use a web worker to start, we can use a web worker. If we're going to maybe later offload this and call off to a server, well, we can do that. So it really is up to us to decide how it is that we want to do it and be able to change it. The deferred object gives us that ability to be able to manage all of that and then raise events when it completes, when it fails, or also even progress. So if you want to set up a progress bar, you could do that with deferred. The basic pattern when you're going to use deferred is as follows. Number one is set up a deferred object, just like that. Number two is to then start whatever the operation is. So if you're going to call off to a server, you're going to set up your web worker, whatever it is, you're going to do that at this point. And then you're going to return back a promise. And it's that promise that the caller or the client is going to use. And the way that you're going to let the caller or the client know that something has happened is by calling resolve, if everything completed successfully, or, in case of a failure, calling reject. So resolve if it succeeded, or reject if it failed. Okay, let's go in and take a look at a demo here. And I'm actually just going to sort of skip to the end here and open up the existing code, just because there's going to be a fair amount of it. So I think it's going to be a bit easier if we walk through everything sort of step by step. So let me start with the worker here. So this is going to be my very simple little worker script. So what you're going to notice is, just like before, self on message. So, hey, we received a message. There we go. And then what you're going to notice is we're going to grab whatever the start time is, just for update purposes later, and then we're going to simulate a long-running operation. And so rather than writing a whole bunch of JavaScript to actually do a long-running operation, I'm going to do what everybody else does, which is just to go ahead and put in some form of a sleep mechanism here. Which, by the way, if you're a contractor, this is a great way to get yourself some additional work. Just occasionally sneak in a little sleep statement. The client calls you up and says, hey, this is running really slowly. Just go back to your code, remove the sleep statement, and hey, look, it's running that much faster. Don't do that. It's a joke. I'm kidding. All right. In any event, so I've got the simulation of a sleep. You are going to notice that out of the box, JavaScript doesn't actually have a sleep. So there's the little function there that's just going to loop on time. And that's all that I'm doing right down below there. So we're going to simulate the sleep. We're going to build up the return message, where we're also going to append out the start time. And then, of course, we're going to send the message back to the caller. So all of that is what we've already seen here. So we already know that. The next little script that we're going to open up here is my little client. And so this is going to be a function called process message. And what I want to highlight here is, there we go, is this part right here. Save for the little line in the middle. Save that little line in the middle. Everything else is identical. We've already seen this. That what you're going to notice right here is we're going to create a brand new worker. What you're going to notice right here is we're going to receive a message back. And then what you're going to notice right here is we're going to send a message to the worker. We've already seen that. There's nothing that's new there. But what we want to do is we want to abstract that away from the caller. We don't want the caller to know what we're doing. All that the caller should know is that this is going to take a little while. So the way that we do that is by first setting up our deferred object. So just var deferred equals $.deferred. And again, this is a jQuery thing. So that's coming from jQuery. Generally speaking, I don't want to say always because that's not the case, but generally speaking, if you see a $sign, that's going to be jQuery, generally speaking. All right, so we've got our deferred. Then what we're going to do is when we receive the message back, we know that it's going to be inside of e.data, and it's, in this case, going to be a message property, so we're just going to pull that right off of there. What we're going to do is rather than updating the UI like we did before, we're going to call this little resolve method. And what that's going to do is that's going to alert anyone who's using the promise object that the operation has completed successfully. So now they'll know, oh, okay, cool, this is done. And they'll also have access to the data that we send in. And then down at the very bottom here, what you're going to notice is we're just going to return the promise back to the caller. So the caller just gets the promise. So they don't know what we're doing behind the scenes. They just simply know that something's going to take a little while. And that's it. So if we now take a look at our promises, kind of go back to our slides, this is going to be the caller side. So again, certain operations can take some unknown amount of time. Asynchronous programming allows us to go ahead and spin that off. And the jQuery promise is going to be an implementation of what's known as the promise pattern. And the promise pattern basically just simply says, hey, look, here's a token. Once this is done, I'm going to let you know via this token. I promise you that. That's what this is. And so it gives us the ability to set up event handlers for if it fails, if it succeeds, or if it's, still running. So if you want to set up a little progress bar, you have the ability to go in and do that. Now, the 3 events in question here are done, which is going to let us know that it completed successfully. Fail, which is going to let us know that it was unsuccessful. And then finally, progress, which is going to let us know, hey, there's been some form of a progress update. The one that we're typically going to be interested in is done. I also want to mention, however, that off of a jQuery promise, there's a then method as well. And the way that the then method works is it actually takes 3 parameters that are in order: done, fail, and progress. So that way you can just do them all in one fell swoop there. OK, so now let's take a look at our promises and close this entire thing out. So here's my little bit of HTML. And so what you're going to notice is that I've got my basic little UI. We're going to have a message. We're going to have an input box. And we're going to have a little button. And then we're going to have our results and our result list down below. And then what you're going to notice is that I'm loading up my jQuery. And I'm loading up that little client script that we showed a minute ago. Now, here's the great part, is that my code here does not need to know what we're doing. It doesn't need to know that we're using a worker process. All that it needs to know is that we're going to call that little function that I created called process message, and that it's going to give me back a promise. And that I can use that promise to say, OK, when we're done, let's do something. And so you'll notice that when we're done, I'm going to create a little function right there. And we're going to get in our data. And unlike when we're using our worker, it's not going to be inside of a little data property. It's just going to be the data itself. And then we're just going to append this out. And what's great about this, first of all, is that when I'm calling this, this is much simpler. That I'm not having to load up a worker script or anything like that. That I'm just simply calling this function. And I'm just simply saying, hey, look, when you're done, just let me know. That's it. And I could even actually have sort of simplified things potentially a little bit, is that I could just have said process message dot done, and then put it all together like that. Just really streamline it there. That call the method, hey, when you're done, just give me the data back, and then I'll go ahead and take care of the UI from there. The other great advantage here is, let's say that later on, we want to be able to call off to a server rather than using a worker. I can do that, and nobody has to be any the wiser. As long as I'm just returning back a promise object, the caller does not care. Cool. So now let me go ahead and run this. And here's my little message. And I'm just going to say message 1. And we'll hit send message. Did I not undo enough? I didn't undo enough. There we go. OK. Take 2. There we go. We'll go in and say message 1. And then we'll hit send. And then message 2. And then we'll hit send. And you know what? I'm just going to send message 2 like a couple of times here. I clicked it 4 times. 1, 2, 3, 4. There we go. So you'll notice that, first of all, I'm able, through that little promise, to just be able to say, hey, look, when you're done, just let me know. But the other very big thing here is you'll notice that I'm able to just kind of keep clicking on that little button. There's my worker. I'm going to sleep this for 5 seconds here, just to give myself a little bit of extra time. OK, you know what? There we go. Message. So I'm just going to, click, and I'm going to click, and I'm going to click, and I'm going to click. And what you'll notice here is that it's just going to keep spinning off the appropriate thread. It's going to keep doing its work behind the scenes. And from the client perspective, I obviously don't know exactly what's going on, that I just simply say, hey, here's a message, and it will come back to me. And then I've also got my threading here. So I've got my threading through the workers. I've also have the ability to abstract all of that away and make my life a little bit easier by utilizing those promises.
Okay, so I asked a quick question. What happens, I'm just reading the question from the Q&A.
And I'm going to get a drink of water.
In the case of the worker finishing the work so quickly that it's done before, wait, sorry, I read that wrong. What if in some case the worker finishes the work so quickly before the done function calls finishes?
So if it turned out that the worker was just like instantaneous, one of the things that the browser is going to do is it's going to still, it's basically going to synchronize everything for you. So for example, let me do this real quick. Let me, I'm going to open up my, let's open up my demo. Okay. Yeah, so let's do this. Let's say that I did something like this, that inside of my worker, I just immediately sent right back a message that I just simply said, hello. That just immediately I went ahead and did that. Well, if you take a look at the HTML, what you're going to notice here is that we're going to create the worker, and then we're going to go ahead and add on an on message. And that could pose a little bit of a problem here, because I can pretty much guarantee you that it's going to try and post that message before it's done setting up the event handler. So the question then becomes, okay, well, what's going to wind up happening? One of the things that that the browser will do is it will help synchronize everything for you in that type of a case. So basically, the message will go into like your voicemail, if you will, and wait for the on message event to actually be wired up, and then make sure that that event actually does get bubbled up properly. So if it did turn out that I called off and it was just immediate, the browser is going to make sure that everything is still synchronized properly and everything still flows through properly.
Awesome.
And another question or no?
Nope, that's all we got. Wait. What font size are you using in Visual Studio?
16?
16.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a problem. And another question was asked how many modules are left. We have 2.
We have 2. We have 2. Yep. We are going to eat first, though.
Yes, please.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to do that. So we're going to break for about an hour, and we're going to grab some food, and you're more than welcome to grab some food. Say again? We'll be back around 1. Oh, we're going to be back around 1, I've been told. Our time. So Pacific time will be back around 1. I believe that would be...
we're just getting all these questions.
Yeah, I think that's noon Hawaii time. I don't know. In any event, we're going to be back at about 1. Yeah, we will see you then.
Yeah, and I guess you can keep asking questions in the Q&A. We're just going to be off screen, but we'll be sure to get to your questions as soon as possible.
There you have it. All right, we'll see you back in about 1 Pacific Daylight Time.
Bye.